This is our third talk in the LCC speaker series, and we are super excited today to have Dr. Judith Swan. Dr. Judith Swan is the Associate Director for Writing in Science and Engineering in the Writing Program at Princeton University, where she developed and oversees a writing program for graduate students and postdocs, and collaborates with her colleagues in teaching writing pedagogy to new faculty and fellows in the Writing Center. Dr. Swan's research focuses on writing development during scientific training, on the ways language shapes the interpretation of emerging science, and on the functional congruences that underlie research writing in academic disciplines. As a consultant, she's taught writing to scientists and engineers at all levels of academia, industry, and government, including Rockefeller University, Columbia University, Academica Sinica, Japanese Institute for Genetics, Riken Kobe, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. National Institutes of Health. Sorry, I probably slaughtered some of those. Dr. Swan was trained in biochemistry and molecular biology at Harvard, received her Ph.D. in biology from MIT, and today she will be talking to us about scientific writing from the reader's perspective. What do disciplines have in common? So a warm welcome to Dr. Swan. Thank you so much for taking the time in your evening to talk with us.
All right, well, thank you, Angela. I'm delighted to do this. I'm really looking forward to this talk. It will leave me, and I think I will be rather energized and have trouble getting to sleep in the late evening when we're done. Could I just get a little bit of a sense of who's here? Do you know, we've had 2 years on Zoom, but you know how to change your name on Zoom? And let me remind you of what that is, because I'm going to ask you, it's a way to quickly get a sense of who's in the room. What I'd like to know is, what if you're teaching a course right now, do you teach writing? Do you teach writing in a particular area, in a particular field, or are you teaching something else? So that's what I would like to find out. And the way I'd like you to give that answer is if to change your name briefly in the Zoom screen. So what you do that by hovering the cursor over your own small little window on the self view. And there you see a blue square that has 3 dots. And if you click that, what you'll be able to do is you'll get a pull down menu. And one of the options is rename, which right now looks like it's at the bottom of the choices. So you can click on that and go in and replace your name with your course, at least temporarily. And then I'm going to let you switch it back, so that we can actually talk to each other, not by course name, but by your actual real name, or at least what you'd like to be called this evening. So what are you teaching? Who's here? I still see names.
Some people can't rename.
Okay,
I think
that's
the
possible.
host of the meeting needs to make this possible.
All right, then we won't do it. That was, sorry to spring that on you. It's often the way I start, but that's a new thing to me.
The chat.
Yeah, drop it into the chat. I'd like to say, perfect. Yeah, I see scientific communication. Thank you, Glenn. You can drop it in the chat. So I want this to be the miracles of Zoom. We can have this conversation at all. The limitations of Zoom is I'd much rather be in the room with you and hear from you. So we're going to have to leverage Zoom to do that. Okay, scientific communication, social sciences, great. Technical communication, interdisciplinary communication, cool. Okay, research writing for science, PhD, and undergrads, technical communication, undergrad writing program, cell society, and cool. Okay, this is really, thank you. This is very helpful because it reassures me that what I have planned for tonight is to talk about writing programs, or the concerns of writing pedagogy in general, by using primarily bring the perspective that I have on scientific writing, but I'm part of a very interdisciplinary and collaborative program. So some of what I'm most excited about is the work that is not specifically on science, but includes science in writing pedagogy in general. Okay, so I've got everybody's names, and you know what? I think what I will do is, so my plan for tonight, or for today for you, is to give you some context at the perspective on writing and where it's coming from. So what the writing program is like at Princeton University and why it looks the way it does, so that we have some of the motive for the way that we've structured our courses. Our courses are primarily research focused, and I'll explain why that is. Give you a quick introduction to my program, but also sort of give you an overview of what we find to be particularly challenging in this kind of setting. And that's going to launch us into the more detailed discussion. I then want to think about writing, as I promised, from the reader's perspective, and to take us to two different sets of hands-on examples where we're going to look at pieces of writing and approach them in completely different ways. One approach is through syntax and revision, and the second is source use and citation. But in both cases, what I want to be thinking about is ways that, in particular, knowledge, patterns, strategies, history, experience that non-scientists have just working in language and with language, and particularly if there's any, to the degree that people have often come to writing through a training in literary studies or in language studies, how that can be leveraged and to find similarities in what look like very dissimilar moments. And so that's my core thesis, that you'll see that I'm quite willing to say that disciplines differ, and that scientific writing is different from other writing. But actually, my core argument is that it's all the same, and there's as much in common as there's not in common, and we'll put that into play. I hope that that'll take about an hour, 15 hour, 30 minutes, and that gives us the last 30 minutes for questions, discussion, etc. I will tell you now that I would really, if you want to stop and talk about something within reason, at least, I would like to, this is for you. And I'm trying to guess at what might be engaging topics for us to consider and material for us to work on together. And if something grabs you and you want to stick with it, great. And if not, we'll get through both of them, and so you can ask at that point any question, not only about what I've talked about, but about all the things that I haven't talked about, because there's a whole lot of scientific communication and writing that I'm not going to talk about. Okay, sound like a plan? We're on board? All right, I'm going to share my screen then and start the PowerPoint when I figure out where it is. There it is. Okay. All right. An opening slide, and I've already done the first slide, which is to sort of introduce myself. A little more to introduce myself, though, that my training is actually in molecular biology. I was an undergraduate at Harvard University, where I worked in the laboratory, the first woman to be tenured through the ranks of the biochemistry department. And then I got my graduate degree from MIT, where one of my classmates has gone on to win the Nobel Prize. Sometimes I show a slide of him standing in Stockholm. Anyhow, I'm looking at where things are. Okay, yes. I was just got startled by what's coming up. And so I fully expected to be a research scientist, and I made a switch after graduate school, in part from my experience in writing in science, that I had, as you can imagine, phenomenal mentors, really, and fabulous peers. So when it came time to learn about experiments, research, or science, I had marvelous people to work with and got tremendous instruction and advice and feedback. But when it came time to write, nobody actually had very much to say, and most of what people had to say was not very helpful. It was sort of like, you know how to do this, right? And any of you, I'm assuming a lot of people here have been through graduate school, and there is that moment in graduate school where people say to you, you know how to do this. And of course you say, sure, I do, yes. And so I went off to try to do it. And one of the things I noticed, which sort of is the seed of the work I'm doing now, is that although in the process of writing, although my data did not change, my results did. That the party line I had internalized about writing is it was after the fact, it was the communication of thought, at least in science, that the work was in the laboratory and the science was in the laboratory. And the writing was just sort of like taking dictation or writing up your shopping list or filling out your tax forms. It just happened and it just was a performance. And I noticed in writing my dissertation and writing articles that that didn't accurately describe my experience. That in fact, when the data stayed the same, but the results changed, I was still doing science. But I was doing it in this stage of writing, and I had the good sense to recognize, oh, why doesn't anybody have anything to say about this? So that's what launched me into thinking up to switching into writing, and that's where I've made my career. And eventually ended up in the Princeton writing program. So I just want to give you a quick overview of our writing program to set the stage here. So the writing program in its current instantiation was reconstituted in 2001. Okay, I actually taught in this writing program in 1990 to 93, and it didn't look like, it taught at Princeton in their writing program. It didn't look anything like this, and I left. It was like there was no room for scientific writing there. I went to the engineering school at Penn. Our writing program got reconstituted in 2000, 2001 with a focus on the freshman year, with the notion of having a writing seminar, because Princeton had a good freshman seminar program. And it also had a writing requirement that most students fulfilled by just taking a course that had a lot of writing and nobody ever talked to them about writing. And this was actually, we had an external review that suggested that was a scandal. And so the university opened up resources to create a writing seminar. And that was in 2001. So the seminar, as Angela and I were talking, caps at 12 students. It's a one semester course. It's required of all incoming students in their first year. And it's a seminar that's topic-based. So we hire a staff of PhDs who are trained in a variety of disciplines to offer courses, 12 courses for undergraduates that are writing focused, but where students write about a particular topic. So that's the writing seminars. And that's one element of our program. So I'm going to, writing seminars is a portion. We also have a writing center that predates this. It's quite enormous. It does over 5,000 appointments a year. In 2006, I launched graduate programs, Writing in Science and Engineering, which are courses now for postdocs as well as for graduate students. These are half-term courses. And so for a while, we were sort of what we called a donut. We had first-year undergraduates and PhD students, and everybody in between was in the Writing Center and nowhere else. And that has a lot to do with the orientation around writing at Princeton. It's the culture around writing that we inherited in 2000, and we've been trying to change and gradually doing so for the past 20 odd years. So here are our Princeton is a very selective university, gets a lot of really talented students. This is a picture of them arriving on campus. They're eager, they're 18, they're anxious, they've been well-trained in high school, and now they come to the university, and the university says they should take a writing seminar. Now, the other thing you need to know about Princeton is it has a senior thesis requirement that all students at Princeton must conduct independent research in their senior year in order to graduate. And there are a couple other universities in the US that require this. Most places that have a thesis give you a way to graduate without a thesis. Princeton does not. So 100% of our students are expected to do independent research before they graduate as seniors. In 2000, when the writing seminars were set up, the university totally took on board what is sometimes referred to as the inoculation theory of writing. We're supposed, in their eyes, we're supposed to teach them in this one course everything they should need to know about writing so that as juniors and seniors or graduate students, they will show up in completely different settings and situations in different departments and somehow know everything they're supposed to know about writing without anybody talking to them about it. Now, you can already hear that I don't think this is particularly realistic. So there's actually a name for this in composition studies, as you may know. It's called the transfer problem. How do you teach, even if you teach well and teach a set of skills that are transferable to other situations, how students have actually trouble accessing that information and moving it over. And you can see that in our case, we will quite frankly say the transfer problem at Princeton is the notion of having a first year course, and we don't have writings in the disciplines, and we don't have follow-up courses yet. We're working on it. It's taken 20 years to get the door open on that. This is a form of magical thinking, that somehow something's going to happen in this freshman course. So that's the problem that we've been grappling with for 20 years. What can we do in this freshman course that might actually facilitate the transfer from the setting of a writing seminar to the disciplines all over the university? And the answer that we've come up with is something that we call metadisciplinary awareness. So it's essentially what we're teaching now, and teaching quite explicitly in that seminar, and I'm going to introduce you to with some hands-on examples, is the notion that what we need to be talking about is kind of research and writing about research in a way that crosses disciplines, trying to figure out what do disciplines have in common and what do they have that's different, and to make that a metacognitive move in our writing courses, so that as students are writing, they're also querying, how does this writing fit into a map of research in general as a generic phenomena and research in a very localized place? So that, this is the transfer problem writ large. There's also, the transfer problem is particularly acute in the sciences. So this is a quote from Keith Horshaw, who used to be at Cornell, and I really like, although writing is probably more essential to academic life than any other activity, no other dimension of the lives of scholars is so carefully concealed, politely ignored, and thoroughly excluded from teaching. Scientists spend an enormous proportion of their time producing articles, grants, peer reviews, textbooks, and other professional writing, but undergraduate instruction in the sciences almost entirely ignores the fact that scientists are writers. So the transfer problem is even more acute when we're working with students in training to be scientists, because the discipline has essentially disowned any discussion of writing and very much, thinks that it's supposed to happen in the writing seminar. So what do I mean by metadisciplinary awareness? It's in part this two-part simultaneous contradictory claim. I'm totally willing to say that academic writing is not the same across disciplines. You pick up an article in sociology or in economics or in literary studies, and the differences jump off the page and we see them. And at the same time, my position is that academic writing is the same across all disciplines, that there is a vantage point, a perspective to look at any piece of academic writing and to notice, at a functional level, there are certain things that need to happen in every research setting. And so I realize I should have an extra slide here. I want to make a distinction between function and feature. So the sense that academic writing in disciplines differs in lots of overt and visible features. And often underneath that are a set of functions that are quite related to one another. So what we surround this with is, we think about academic writing, and this is and is notness of it is, well, how do we name that? So when we talk about academic writing, we have a lexicon that we use and that I will be using in part here. We think it's really important to be able to name what are the features that writing has in common. I'm going to approach a lot of those features from the perspective shortly of readers. So this is a lexicon that we use. It may be familiar, and I'm not going to get stuck I'm not going to suggest that anybody needs our particular lexicon, but this is the we find that talking about academic writing in terms of structure, of thesis, of motive, the idea of that academic writing is always purposeful. Everybody uses citations. There are key terms in every field. The question of methodology arises even in literary studies where the methodology is assumed. As soon as you step out of literary studies, you have to start defining methodology. And everybody worries about evidence and analysis. So this suggestion that by thinking metadisciplinarily, what we're also triggering here is the structure of metaphor. You know, metaphor is X both is and is not Y. And so I'm asking you to hold this in mind. To hold the whole talk in mind as a sense of metaphor, that yes, absolutely, writing the sciences is different from writing in other fields, and writing in the sciences is exactly the same thing as writing in any other field. Okay, so let me take us somewhere. So and I do this because metaphor is catalyzes transfer. So we're essentially asking students, even as we're training in very granular and nitty-gritty things, to be thinking metaphorically and thinking about, okay, I'm doing this here in this context, but this act, this action, this piece of work I'm doing is something that's going to appear in almost any other setting I go into. All right. So I'm offering that as a framework for what I want us to do. And I first want to think about, so the approach that I want to take to this is to think about readers. And that was the second reason that I jumped ship from moving from science into language studies, is that I was fortunate enough to arrive at Duke University. I met the then director of writing, George Gopin, who was in the English department and had a methodology for thinking very systematically about how readers work with text and make meaning, and using that as a guide to writing. So this is a gift that I give to all of my, all the graduate students, or actually any students I talk to, that if we worry about think about writing from the writer's perspective, there are a lot of concerns about what do I want to do, and this sense, particularly with our incoming freshmen, but even our graduate students, a sense of like, this is the first time I'm doing this, I might not know what I'm doing, and there's a lot of anxiety around it. All of us are, however, generally much more experienced readers of the genres we're writing. So students, even in their first year of college, we give them an exposure to examples of academic writing and give them more opportunity to read, but read metacognitively and think about, and then transfer that to writing. So this is where the lexicon comes in mind, that what do we know if we're all much more experienced readers, and we know things as readers about how language works and how language works on us and what moves us to think differently and what moves us to take up new ideas and what moves us to be puzzled and what moves us to do cognitive labor. So we know a ton as readers, but we haven't had a language for mapping what it is that readers know and using it as guidelines for what writers do. And this is actually the work of Joseph Williams at the University of Chicago, is the person who first developed this, his colleague Greg Colomb, again, George Gopin. So this is where it comes out of cognitive psychology and linguistics and tries to actually get at how do readers make sense of text? How can we make some predictions about how readers read? And they make some very specific claims. One is that readers have a finite amount of energy, that reading is a cognitive task that is energy intensive. And so that at any given moment, readers approach the act of reading with only a certain amount of cognitive attention. And that once their attention is depleted, they don't take anything else in. Okay, we're going to use that as a guide for thinking about writing. Secondly, that readers engage with language for interpretation, and that interpretation follows a pattern. First, they interpret for structure. And by that, I mean, they look at the marks on the page, the word, interpret them into words, but then interpret the words into larger structures, clauses, sentences, paragraphs, sections, documents. And that structural, the identification of structure is required in order to make meaning and interpret for substance. that the way language works is it sets first a map of possible interactions and relationships signaled by structure, and then the words themselves offer the content to be mapped onto that. And that William's argument was that that happens at every level of language, all the way down to sentences, which is where I'm going to take us and actually look at one of these expectations in play at the level of sentences. The readers first read for structure and then for substance. And my little gesture there is that it's like they're paying attention to structure. How are these words language? What makes them a sentence? Am I reading a paragraph? Is it the title of a paper? I need to know that before I figure out what does it mean. So if you put these two postulates together about readers, that they have a finite amount of energy, and they interpret first for structure and then for substance, we can actually arrive at a working definition of bad writing in general and bad scientific writing especially, that this is a zero-sum game. Energy that goes to figuring out the structure is simply not available to figure out the substance. So bad writing, from a reader's perspective, is writing that requires a disproportionate amount, an excessive amount of the reader's attention and energy, simply to figure out how to put it all together. Because if we're spending all of our time trying to figure out how these words add up to a sentence, or how this thought is connected to the previous thought, then we have precious little energy to figure out what it might be trying to tell us. Okay, so what this leads to is a framework for thinking about writing that says, hey, readers base most of their substantive interpretations on instructions they take from the structure. So this is what George Gopin actually called reader expectation theory, but it's a notion that what we all do when we read, regardless of what we're reading, is we're trying to understand the instructions that we, by habit and implicit experience, take from the structure about what to do with the substance. Now, this sounds, I'm sure, very abstract. It won't be abstract when we get into the nitty-gritty in a couple minutes. So what it says, though, is that readers have really discrete expectations, and they use those expectations to guide their interpretive decisions as they're reading a passage. And specifically, we could outline, readers have a whole bunch of things. They have specific expectations about where in the structure of prose they will find particular kinds of information. And I'm going to, before I even give you the examples, just say that this is an easy sell to people who work with scientists, because the scientific research article is the most structured academic document out there. So we're at the document level, this makes perfect sense. We have different expectations about the information in the results section, or in the methods section, or in the introduction. But I want you to notice you can move a sentence between those sections, take the same sentence and drop it into each section, and we would interpret it slightly differently. So what I'm trying to do here is, this is the first move in most of my classes, is to bring this reader awareness to the surface so that we can start to explore it and see where it might guide us in terms of writing. So at a document level, we know this about scientific research articles. This is the part that's really easy sell to scientists. They say, well, of course, that's obvious. But what I want to say is that it's about every part of language. So they have readers have expectations about where they will find the action in a sentence, the agent or the thing or person responsible for that action, whose story this sentence is telling, what orientation does the reader take through it, the linkage between this sentence and the previous sentence, the important information in this sentence that deserves emphasis, the issue that's going to be discussed for a passage or a paragraph, the point of that discussion, the point of the entire paper. There's locational instruction that guides readers' interpretations in all these areas. And what we're going to look at is a particular set of expectations that are early on in this list. So I actually want to take us to a hands-on example of thinking about reader expectation using a scientific example. And so, and just to come in and talk about what is, in fact, a generic concern of writing, a way of thinking about revision in general of any piece of writing, but we're going to look at a scientific example to get there. Is that making sense? Are we on board? Does that sound reasonable? Okay. This is the moment of like, I know that people want the slides and because I'm doing handouts, you actually need slides, but this is the moment where I'm normally scanning the room saying, did any of that make any sense to you? All right, good. Here we go. All right. So I'm going to give you a piece of scientific writing. And it's actually, I'm going to do one other thing. I need to, I need to get out of, how do we do this? I'm having the moment of staring at how do I get behind the power? I'm going to exit for a moment. Sorry. What I'm going to do, folks, is drop in the chat a link to a handout. Okay, I have everything in this handout almost on the screen, so you don't need to look at the handout, but I want you to have it, and I'm going to go back to share it, do my PowerPoint, and see if I come back on the screen. You never know. Okay, yay, let me go back. All right, cool. And that's to activate the chat as well, because I'm going to ask you to put things in the chat. So here's an example taken from a scientific research article. The effects reported, and what I'm going to do, I'm just going to read it aloud to you so that you can hear it and let it wash over you. And the question I'm going to ask you to answer in the chat is, if somebody handed this text to you, what kind of feedback would you give them on it? How would you approach talking to this writer about this particular text? And you can do it in a variety of ways. I'm going to ask us in our follow-up to think about features that get your attention versus questions of function. All right. So as an example from a scientific article, here we go. The effects reported in this study have one of two explanations. Either the congeners themselves have direct and permanent effects upon the central nervous system, or there may be a retardation of the metabolism of ethanol by the congener so that it has a stronger effect. The probability of the latter is less because the observation of the effects occurred well after the blood alcohol concentration were immeasurably small. There will now be a quiz. I would like you to paraphrase and summarize this passage for me. No, I'm not going to ask you to do that. What I am going to ask you is, do you like this? Is this easy to read? Is this taking a lot of energy? Or no, is it just a breeze to get through? So comments in the text. How does this passage strike you? What would you say about it? I want to hear your response to it. Is it clear? Is it easy to read? Is it a mess? I don't understand. What do you want to point to? A little bit dense, discipline specific. Yeah. Okay, Letitia, lovely. Thank you for that. I find it very well structured, but I lack the technical knowledge. Anybody else feel that way? That your reaction upon seeing this is, oh, I can see that it's sentences and I don't understand it. And now the hypothesis, I'm going to ask you to consider it as a hypothesis. I don't understand this because I lack the technical knowledge. Okay, just hold that as a hypothesis. Writing from his own perspective, reasoning not what the reader's interested in. So notice, I feel like lovely. There's a kind of like, oh, I don't get it. Now, what makes you think that this is writing for a specialist? What are the features of this text that suggest that there's somebody out there who should be able to understand it, and it's just not you? Technical vocabulary, yeah. So this is great. I read it right. I need to read it many times, and who has that much energy to read it many times? No, nobody summons to reading an article 5 times the energy it takes to read an article, because I expect to read it 5 times to get it once. Okay, so we notice the technical language, and this is and the sentences are long. So these are all the things that people say. That second sentence is technical language. Anybody know what a congener is? No. And you know what? I don't either. Well, actually I did look it up, but we notice congener, metabolism, ethanol, it's sentences. They all sound like good sentences. The problem must be that I don't understand enough about the words and the field to make sense of it. So I want to trigger, this is exactly why I want to trigger that experience of it. I'm going to introduce you to a reader expectation, and then we're going to come back and apply that expectation here. This is an example for applying the expectation rather than developing it. So I want us to hold this. This is what I mean by we bump into something outside our discipline, and what pops up is I don't understand it, and I notice things that tell me it's not for me. I don't understand what a congener is. There's this vocabulary I don't get. So it must not be my work. It must not be directed towards me. It must be directed towards somebody else. I call this the invisible cognoscenti, that reader behind you who knows all these words and understands this, and it's just not you. Okay, so we're going to revisit this in a moment. I want to instead do a hands-on example that takes us through a reader expectation. So this is one where, this is part of why I get the handout. I'm going to actually ask you to do some work. So I want you to work with this slide and do some work so that you can actually answer my questions. So here are two sentences. What would be the company reception according to the introduction of such a proposal? That's 2A. 2B, how would the company receive such a proposal? How would the company receive such a proposal? So we have two sentences here. First question I have for you, would you not agree that 2B is a lot easier to read? Yeah, okay. And why? And your reaction might be to say that it's shorter, and yeah, that's true, and we're all taught that shorter is better, but 2B is shorter because it leaves something out. And for all we know, the writer who wrote 2A was intending something that 2B doesn't make possible any longer because something's been left out. So, and notice that these sentences, neither of them are very long. One is 7 words, 8, and the other one's only 13. I mean, these are not particularly long sentences. So attacking, well, 2A is too long. There's something about the verb. Yes, there's an action verb. So there's also 2A is passive and B is active. And some of you may have been taught that, I'm not going to go very far with this inside, that the passive is weak and immoral and you should avoid it if at all possible, except that if you go into science, you keep hearing that, well, in science, the passive is preferred. And it's often one of the questions I get about scientific writing. Nima's knows, oh, great. Somebody, you guys are gonna be great. I can already see the linguistic piece here. Okay, so let me ask you the question. This is the work I would do with my students and actually do, and this is the work that I actually do in these workshops and with scientists all over the place. So I want you to read 2A, and here's my question. I want you to identify the words in 2A that indicate actions going on in this sentence. So I want you to interpret 2A and identify the words that you think indicate actions in this sentence. And by that, I mean the author of 2A observes something in the world. She wishes to communicate that to us. She composed 2A. Okay, yeah, no, don't give me what the words are. I want you to identify them, and you don't need to drop them in the chat yet. And I want you to count up how many you've identified. Because what I'm going to ask you to drop in the chat is the number of words you identify here. So I want you to look at 2A, identify words that you think are actions going on in this sentence, and then count how many words you've identified as an action. Okay, and this is, now is when I wish I could see your faces, because this is the moment in my workshops that everybody looks away from me, because this turns out to feel like a really hard question. And it's a moment, so I'm just going to point this out to you, that I'm guessing, if this feels like a hard question, what do you mean, how many actions in this sentence? Could we just step out for, it shouldn't be a hard question. How many actions in a sentence? But in this sentence, it feels like a hard question. So this is what we're trying to get at. So, all right. Now, next, lovely, 3, 2 or 3, 5. Did anybody underline 0 words or identify 0 actions? And if you're not sure what's an action in the sentence, I consider that 0. Any zeros? Yeah. How about anybody do 1 word? I see 2, I see 3, I see 5, I see 4. Yes, okay. So this is the shift to readers. Because what we've just done is we've taken a piece of text, we've handed it to readers, we've asked readers to interpret, and we've got interpretations that are all over the map. So we're getting anywhere from, 2, 3, 4, 5 words. So 4 different answers. Now, that's just how many you underline. Now, if we go to start dropping, what should you identify as an action? That number would grow, not 4 different answers, but more like 5 or 6, maybe 7 different answers. In a room of, what are we, about 32 people who are highly educated, and I presume highly intelligent and very experienced readers who cannot agree among themselves about what is an action in a 13-word sentence of no intellectual significance whatsoever. That's what I want us to understand. That's what I want to understand. Now, would you do the same thing in 2B? Identify the word or words that are indicating actions going on in sentence 2B. And would you drop that number in the chat? I got a 2. 2. Oh, this is going to be really interesting. Well, is everybody 1? Okay, I got some 1s. 1, 3. Cool. All right. So we want to sort this out. We're getting a little more consensus. It's not quite all over the place. Let's start with 1. Somebody who said one action in this sentence. What did you say that action was? So let's just let the ones answer. If you said there was only one action, what word did you identify as the action? And drop that in the chat. Receive. Anybody identify, any ones identify anything besides receive? Would receive, yeah. 1 unit, that's the 2, would receive, got it. Lovely, because it's lovely working with people for whom English is an acquired language, because you have so much better sense of the syntax and grammar than native speakers do, including me. Right, of course, 2. Okay, would receive, so receive, yes. Why, so you all agree. So stop for a moment. We have consensus around 2B. We got a lot of people who think that receive is an action. Why? And this, why are you so sure that receive is an action, or would receive is an action? It's syntactic. The instructions here. It's a verb, yeah. And so most of us were taught that a verb is an action word, but of course that's not true. What that sentence, a verb is an action word, is actually a garbled reader expectation. Not a verb is a grammatical structure that links a noun and changes with mood, tense, and time, and is important. It exists in every language that's ever been spoken by humans. What readers expect a verb to communicate is action. So that's our reader expectation here. And so what I'm trying to raise is like, as a default, readers look to the structure verb for information about what might be an action. And when we do that in 2B, how would, as part of the verb, the company receive, that's the rest of the verb, such a proposal, the verb is received, the action is receiving. We look at those 2 and say, that makes sense. Receive and receive, I got it. The action is receive. And there's a consensus around that I'm going to argue is coming from the structure and coming from the fulfillment of an expectation. Okay, let's go back to 2A. We had a lot of different interpretations about what's an action in 2A. And I'm going to just, for the sake of clarity here, the only person who knows for sure what is an action in 2A is the author of 2A. So we're going to have the fact that we disagree with one another. Some of you are going to have reactions when I tell you what the author intended of like, oh, I got that wrong. No, you didn't. You did exactly that same reader interpretive move onto A, and it led you all in different directions. And so what is it that 2A is doing and why are we so scattered? So I've spoken to the author of 2A. I know what she intends. I'm going to tell you, but if it's not what you thought, it's not your fault, it's hers. Okay, so don't feel bad. All right, so I went to her and said, okay, let's figure out what might be an action here. What would be, and I stopped there. I said, would be is part of a verb in 2A. And I asked the author, is that an action in this sentence? She thought about it for a moment. She said, well, I guess that would be about future existence or conditional existence, something that might happen. No, nope, this is not what the sentence is about. I said, well, gee, you've made it your verb. Verbs are not always action words. Here is a verb that doesn't have an action in it. The verb to be has an action in it. It's the action of existence or equivalence. And she says, no, that's not what I want you to do here. And so that's already a problem. All right, onward. What would be the company reception? Now, I could already see in the chat that several of you thought that reception was an action in A. Yeah. And guess what? The author agrees with you. Reception is an action in her reading, except, and I love this, somebody dropped in the chat already, it's not a verb, it's a noun. In fact, it's a nominalization. It's a noun made from an action. Okay, and the normalizations are all over the place in language and in English. Very commonly, verbs get made into nouns by putting a suffix at the end of them. And normalizations abound in scientific writing, right? Centrifugation, separation, analysis. There's all these nouning and thinging reifications of actions. And they're just all over the place. So I'm going to go back here for a moment. So reception, she intends reception to be interpreted as an action, and yet it's an action that's showing up in a noun. So we're only halfway through the sentence and we've had a verb that isn't an action and an action that isn't a verb. And you're reacting to that already. So some of you said, yeah, I've got reception, but not everybody picked that up because it's missing the flags that say, pay attention to me as action. Okay, let's move on. The next word is accorded. And I already saw that several of you landed on accorded. And actually, if you were in the room, I would ask for a show of hands, because what happens is anywhere from 40 to 70% of readers respond by saying, yes, accorded is an action in this sentence. That's how I read it. Okay, let me go tell you what the writer said. So I went to the writer and said, tell me, is according an action? Is that what's going on? Is that what you're communicating to us? And she had to pause for a moment. She said, well, what is to accord? To accord is to make harmonious or make peace or bring into alignment and agreement. You know what? It's not an action. It's not my action. I'm not talking about anybody according anything. And then she went further. She said, oh man, introducing, proposing, and receiving are potentially actions, but according among them, no, I don't want to say that. So she's done sort of the worst thing possible. The reason everybody goes to accorded is A, it's the verb, and B, it's the most important looking word in the sentence. It's the one that gives you the sense of, oh, if I can figure out what according is doing here, then I would understand. And yeah, well, what according is doing here is filling up the verb without adding any information and making it harder to get the dance going between proposing and introducing and receiving. Now, quick aside, I'm not saying that normalizations are good or bad. Normalizations take actions and put them into nouns. There are good normalizations, particularly when you take an action that was an action in some other sentence, and it's not an action in this sentence, but it's still part of the sentence. And you can see an example of that in 2A in proposal. Yeah. I asked the author, is anybody proposing anything in your sentence in this moment? And she said, no, no, no. The proposing happened in the previous sentence. This sentence is about receiving the proposal. So a good what I'm going to call, for lack of better, a skillful normalization is the shifting of an action from a verb to a noun because it's just a thing in the sentence. It's not the action. An unskillful normalization is reception, because she wants us to land on reception as an action, but it's a noun, and next to it is this very fancy looking verb, accorded, and readers split, and everybody makes this sentence about according. Now, I'm going to wrap this up really quickly by saying there's one more normalization in 2A. We're almost done with our principle. We'll go back and look at that example. We're almost done. So we've got one more normalization in 2A, and that's introduction. So we've got three normalizations. One's an action that would have been better as a verb. One's a genuine normalization in this situation because it's about a previous action. What about introducing? Is it an action or not? Only the author knows for sure. So let's think about that. I wrote 2B. So I'll give you full disclosure. I wrote 2B, and I came up with 2B and said, okay, this sentence is unwieldy. And yes, as I forgot who it is in the text said, it's got this nominalized reception. If that's the action, let's put it in the verb. And introduction, well, if proposal's already happened, then so has introduction, and I don't need it. So I'm going to get rid of it. And so I came up with 2B and said, what do you think of 2B? And the author of 2A said, it's easy to read, it's direct, it's forceful, and I hope you get to use it someday, Judy, because it is a terrible revision of 2A. It's a big moment for me. Okay, so this is what happens with our students all the time. We say, you're saying X, and if we're lucky, they say, no, I'm not. I have just given back what I understood as a reader, and the writer says, nope, that's not what I meant. What do I now know? I now know that I have no idea what 2A means because 2B is my interpretation of it, and I just learned I am wrong. I also know, however, how I got to 2B, which is that I went looking for actions, and if they weren't verbs, I made them into verbs. And so I asked the author to do that. And I'm going to give you one more term here. I asked her at the same time, since every verb needs a subject, would she make as the subject of this verb the agent or the person or thing responsible for that action? And in no time at all, she came up here with 2C. How would the company receive such a proposal? Well, thanks, I got that. If the board, where did they come from? Introduced it at this time. That's what 2A was trying to say. Okay, quick question. How many actions? How many actions in 2C? 2, yeah? You can hear the two verbs. How would the company receive such a proposal if the board introduced it at this time? How many actions were there in 2A? Just 2. And what I find is when I go around, if I ask people, how many people underlined or identified reception and introduction as the actions in 2A and nothing else, it's usually about less than 10% of readers do that. So this is not a scientific example, but we've got a reader expectation here. And I'm going to give you the names for it here in the next. I'm going to give you the boxes, and then we'll go back to that previous example of the congeners. Okay, I'm going to have to do this in 2 different ways. All right, so that here's the expectation that at the syntactic level of structure, subject, verb, complement. This is the core unit of an English sentence in that order. English, it has this SVC structure. Readers have discrete, that's the top level of boxes in dark blue. The lower level are substantive expectations. What do readers anticipate will arrive in those locations? And what we started with is that they look to the verb to get articulated the action, and they expect the subject of that verb to spell out, to name the agent responsible for that action. And notice that this produces an active sentence. Now, these are expectations. They're not rules. You can write a passive sentence and it's a great sentence and it flips everything. It puts the goal as the subject. So I'm not saying that every sentence, this is not a rule. This is not how to write, but these are the expectations that readers are bringing to a task, the task of reading. And when those expectations are fulfilled, readers get much further at sorting out what is the game, or what's the information I'm trying to get out of this particular passage. When those expectations are violated, then readers have to go and put the words together and make their own sense of it, and it might not be the sense the writer intends. Okay, so I've developed a reader expectation principle, and I want to go back to, we're going to rewrite, and this is the tricky bit, because you know what, I'm just going to recite it. We're going to rewrite that congeners example number 1. So we're going to revisit that. So I want to take this principle and go look at congeners. I'm not going to define congeners. I'm not going to grapple with the technical language. I'm just going to empower you to do what all of you know how to do, which is look for actions and look for verbs. And let's see what happens if we revise it. And then we'll look at what it means. Okay. So the first sentence, how shall I do this? Yeah, nope, I want to go this way. The effects, I'll just recite it. The effects reported in this study have one of two explanations. The effects reported in this study have one of two explanations. Question: what might be an action in that sentence?
Explain.
Explain. What's the verb? Let's go there first. Pull out the verb. Have. Yeah. Okay. So notice if you're going to explain, I mean, it makes sense because we're primed now for normalizations. You can already see it's reading a little differently. The verb is the verb to have. Now, have the perfectly reasonable verb, but it's about possession or ownership. This is scientific prose. That's probably not a relevant action. Nobody's arguing about who owns something here. So notice, however, that if the action's not in the verb and you start looking at nouns, explanation, perfectly big fat normalization, but there's a lot of other normalizations around there too, yeah? Study, effects, as reported. So we, reported. You might just like, what's an action? Oh, it's reporting. Well, is it a report or is it report? What's going on here? So there's a lot of candidates. And what this is flagging that, oh, as readers, we have our sort of default way of reading. And when it doesn't work, we make it all up. So I asked the authors, what's the action? What do you want to be an action here? And they said, explain. So let's make it a verb. And I'm going to move quickly here. We could talk, because I love this example. We could go on for a while. So if it's the verb, who's the agent responsible for explaining? It's the authors. And we could have a whole discussion about the first person or not, but I'm just going to put it there for the moment. We can explain the effects reported in this study. That's the results, which is a different. So we can explain our results, and we've got most of the sentence there. We're still missing something. We've lost the one of two. So I'm going to keep that around by adding at the end in one of two ways. Moving on to the next clause, and same analysis. And this sentence has 3 clauses, so I think I can recite the first one. Either the congeners themselves have direct and permanent effects upon the central nervous system. Stop there. Either the congeners have direct and permanent effects upon the central nervous system. What might be an action?
Effect.
We're going to the nouns. Let's look at I want you to look at the verb for a moment. What's have an effect? Okay, so those are 2 words. The verb is to have, again, which isn't working any better. It's hard to imagine arguing about possession this time either. And now if you start looking for what might be an action, the only noun floating around is effects. Now, it's quite possible you ask the authors, what's an action in the sentence? And their answer might well be, it isn't in there. But in fact, I asked them this time, this is why it's a great pedagogic example. I asked them, they said, oh, it's affects. That's a noun. Can I make it into a verb? Sure, I make it into affects. Who or what affects? What shall I make as the subject of affect? The congeners, sure. Good. Okay, this is just play with me, if you will. Just keep going on. All right, so we have the congeners affect. We don't know what congeners are, but we know that they do something now, right? The congeners affect the central nervous system. Yeah. So we just took all of that and condensed it. Notice what's been happening. Things are getting shorter, but I'm not trying to make them shorter. I'm making them more direct by dropping action in the verb. Congeners affect the central nervous system. Now we're missing a little bit the direct and permanent. Those were adjectives modifying a noun. I'm going to stick them as adverbs modifying the verb. So congeners directly and permanently affect the central nervous system. Okay, great. Next clause. Or there may be a retardation of the metabolism of ethanol by the congeners. Stop there. There may be a retardation of the metabolism of ethanol by the congeners. They're back. Okay, what might be an action in that clause?
Metabolize.
Yeah, it could be metabolism. It could be retardation. It could be retarding. What's the verb? Maybe. Is it telling us? Clearly, there are things happening here, but they're not happening in the verb. All right. So I spoke to the authors, and in fact, that big fat normalization. And I love that you guys are so good at. I have to teach my students. Like in English, we don't recognize normalization. We don't have the name for it typically. Yeah, retarded. All right. So let's make it into a verb. Retard. Who or what retards? Who's the agent for retarding? And you see how hard we have to work to figure that out? This shouldn't be a difficult. It's the congeners again. I mean, there may be a retardation of the metabolism of ethanol by the, and we expect it to be something else. No, by the congeners. Oh no, they're back. The congeners retard the metabolism of ethanol. It's not even hard. Congeners retard the metabolism of ethanol. Look at that. Last clause, so that it has a stronger effect. Quick, what is it? And you don't, this is the one I'll interrupt you. Can you feel yourself scrambling? Like, I don't know what it is. Is it congeners? Well, no, congeners is plural and it is singular. Is it metabolism? Is it ethanol? I don't know. More important question, how much energy do you have left to try to figure out what the it is as the third clause of a very long, convoluted sentence? Not much. Okay, I'm not going to tell you what the it is. I think I know. I think it's the ethanol, but we're just going to leave it vague. I'm going to ask the question I was asking before. What might be an action? It has a stronger effect. And this is starting to get repetitive, isn't it? What might be an action in that clause? It has a stronger effect. Has is the verb. We didn't like has before. If the action's not has, where might it be? We're back to affects. Okay, so let's unpack that one. And the author said, oh yeah, this is affecting. It affects, and now let's be smart, affects what? The sentence doesn't say, but what? Think parallelisms. It affects the central nervous system. Yeah, the NS, this nervous system. And I've attached we have a stronger effect. I've got to attach it as an adverb more strongly. Okay, we just did two sentences, but I want to take stock of them for a moment. We did two sentences that had three clauses, therefore had four verbs between them. Here are the verbs. Have, has, maybe, has. Are you noticing a pattern? these writers have a habit. When they compose sentences, they put their action anywhere except in the verb. They've done it 4 times in a row. They're going to do it in the next sentence again. And most of our energy, therefore, goes to trying to figure out what are they trying to say, rather than understanding what it is they're trying to communicate. So this is the moment that I switch fields, quite literally. It was with this example when I learned it, because it was like, oh my goodness, nobody's ever talked to me about writing at the level of how am I constructing the micro decisions that lead to my style and the message I communicate. These writers need to change the way they write sentences. And then we can talk about everything else. And that's about language. We don't even need to know what a conjuner is to have that conversation with them. We just have to recognize that their actions and their verbs are always far away from each other. And maybe we would understand something if they weren't. All right, let's wrap up the last sentence, which was the probability of the latter is less. So you hear the lilting alliteration, la, 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 but be honest, isn't this where you drop the ball? Like, oh, there are 2 explanations. The latter, I don't know which one's the latter. I have to go back and figure it out. I don't want to figure it out. This passage is almost over. Maybe I can skip figuring it out and I'll just go forward and maybe it will be clear. Oh, okay. For us, it's not hard. There are 2 explanations. How would we name the latter explanation? What's unique to explanation number 2? Both of them are about the congeners. Both of them are about the CNS. Both of them are about affecting. What's unique? What's in number 2 that isn't in 1? Retarding, yeah. So I don't have to make the reader wander back and guess what one is 1 and 2, and let's name it. Retardation is less probable. Oh, that's explanation number 2, because that's the one with retarding in it. What a great normalization. I love normalizations in their place. Retardation is less probable. Oh, great. Why? Because the observation of the effects occurred. Stop there. The verb has occurred. How likely is it to be the action? Not very, right? Because everything in the world occurs, and these guys haven't put an action in a verb yet, so why should they start now? And they don't. So what might be the action? Observation. It's an anomalization, like they do it over and over. So retardation is less probable because we observe the effects well after the blood alcohol concentrations are immeasurably small. And that should be a small at the end of that, are immeasurable. Okay, guys, this feels more understandable, right? We still don't know what a congener is, but it feels like an experiment. You know what happened. Something affected the central nervous system. We think it was the congeners. Notice, and this is where it gets really interesting, I want you to think for a moment, the line I give to the scientists, I want you to think about mechanism. Think like the scientist you are. What's the difference between explanation 1 and explanation 2 in terms of how the congeners get to the central nervous system? Do you notice something there? It's a structural piece. Let's take it apart this way. What's similar in 1 and 2, explanation 1, explanation 2? Well, who's responsible for what's going on in both of them? The congeners, right? Congeners responsible for everything. What is the target, ultimately? It's the central nervous system. What's happening? What are actions? Well, affecting. So the congeners are affecting the central nervous system in 2 different ways. What's the difference between the way the congeners affect their central nervous system in 1 and the way they affect it in 2? The moment of analysis. So I'm pushing you guys, pushing you a little bit. You can do it. I want you to do it. So I want you to have the confidence to say, oh my goodness, look, we just did this, because I know you can. So the congeners get to the central nervous system by 2 different routes. One is described in 1, one is described in 2. What's the difference? Direct. Yeah. Route 1 is direct, and route 2, explanation 2, is the missing word, indirect. Right? Explanation number 2 says the congeners affect the central nervous system like it's pool, a billiard shot. The congeners affect the central nervous system by retarding the metabolism of ethanol. They affect the central nervous system indirectly. Okay, congratulations. That's a piece of analysis that the authors missed, because they were so happy with the B version that made clear that they had 2 real explanations, that it was a workshop. It was when we start to look at it like this, and somebody said, wait a minute, there's a direct and indirect effect here that's not even getting addressed. So final pass at this, we can explain our results in gotta go back to that. Yeah. There, my underlines, I actually had more. An indirect effect is that the congeners retarded, it affects the CNS more strongly. They directly and permanently affect the CNS. The congeners indirectly affect the CNS by retarding the metabolism of ethanol. And then it's an indirect effect is less probable because we observe the effects well. All right. So anyway, we're done with this. So what I want to do there, I'm going to take some space here to just regroup, and I'm going to turn off the slide for a moment before we do the other one, because I want to take questions and actually see you. So what I've tried to argue is that everybody's writing in sentences, and that what disciplines share in common is they all have readers, and readers have to make sense of sentences, and they have to use the syntax, the structure, what they understand about language to put things in relation. And 90% of the problems of language are about, particularly scientific, but most professional prose, definitely scientific prose, are that things arrive where we don't know what to do with them. That's why we tend to default, oh, if I were in the field and I had all this context, I would independently interpret the words and make the structure out that somebody would agree to, because I'm not getting instructions about how to assemble it. And so this is what carried me into talking about science. And what I tend to do is this kind of thing, to say, let's talk about things to teach in writing, teaching syntax, expectations, sensitivity to readers. What does your reader care about? How is moving from writer-based prose, as Linda Flowers and John Hayes termed it, to reader-based prose is one of the fundamental moves, and it's true regardless of discipline. And so asking to writers in the writing seminars or in the graduate courses to start thinking about how they read, to compare their reading to the reading of other people around them, and to revise to allow readers to navigate by fulfilling readers' expectations. It goes a long way across all disciplines to making things work. So I'm happy to take questions there for a minute. Then I actually want to do this other example, if I can, which I'm going to do quickly. Never know the timing on slides, but I actually want to show you something about citation if possible. But let me stop and field questions for a while, if that's okay. And I'll let Angela moderate as well. Questions, concerns. Is this making any sense? Was this helpful? Is this something you can use? I want very much what happens with my postdocs. I'll keep talking for a moment. My postdocs face disciplines when they're teaching the graduate courses, because we mix all the scientific disciplines together in the same course. Actually, we work with everybody who writes about quantitative data. So we have economists, sociologists, environmental scientists, molecular biologists, physicists, all in the same class. And so the instructors there are, again, they get this, I'm not a physicist, how can I give somebody feedback? And they come to see it like, I'm a reader. And if I can't make sense, if I can't figure out what's happening, why are the congeners here and what are they doing and are they important? If I can't figure that out, that's a writing problem. Don't tell me about defining congeners. Tell me what is the relationship here and what is the language that makes that relationship visible? And then we can get into, well, how would somebody in the field respond to this? And so they too are having to climb over this thing, this hesitation that says, I don't understand this passage. It must be because I'm not an X. And say, no, I don't understand this passage because it's terribly written and it's not giving me any instructions about what to do with those words. And if I have a conversation with this writer, maybe we can figure out what they want to say and get to words that actually make it clear, and then we'll both be much happier.